Here at the Beehive, all the bees are behave, and that's because that's what God wants us to do. We learn our verses from our Bibles, and we like to show them to you. It all starts with Queenie, she knows the verse. She'll tell her stories and what we learned. Peyton is the patient, Willow is wise, Jenny is generous all the time. Dylan happy is so diligent, Louie is so loving, Hudson he is humble as he fights his pride. Grace is always graciously gracious, and then the gentle Jimmy, that's the bees at our hive. Here at the Beehive, all the bees are behave, and that's because that's what God wants us to do. We learn our verses from our Bibles, and we like to show them to you.
Welcome to the Beehive for Memory Monday. Today our story is Be Gracious, Grace, and our memory verse is Proverbs 22:11. One who loves a pure heart and who speaks with grace will have a king for a friend. Can you kids say that with me? Proverbs 22:11. One who loves a pure heart and who speaks with grace will have a king for a friend. As Dylan would say, busy, busy, buzz, buzz. You did great. You're number one. Honey making season was coming to an end in the vibrant meadow, and Grace and all of her friends were happy to enjoy more free time in their days. In a couple weeks, winter would settle on the wildflowers and the bees would be stuck inside. So as they worked, they also made time to take breaks to play in the fresh air while they were able to. On this particular day, Grace and her friends were playing a game of hide and seek. Hudson covered his eyes and began to count. It was his turn to be the seeker, and all of the bees rushed to find the best hiding spot. Hudson was the best seeker in the swarm.
Hurry, Peyton laughed. He'll find us for sure. Willow, over here, Jenny whispered to her friend. She found a hiding spot where both of them could fit. Grace giggled as she slid under a daisy in Mrs. Baker's flower garden. She smiled as Hudson called out, "Bruh, ready or not, here I come." One by one, Grace heard Hudson find her friends. She was pleased he had not found her. Perhaps she would be the winner of this round. A shadow passed over Grace, and she held her breath, expecting Hudson to pop under the leaf and announce that he'd found her. Instead, she saw a giant shoe that belonged to a young boy. Grace opened her little mouth to scream out for help, but before any sound could escape, a jar covered her. Several hours had passed, and Grace's friends were becoming concerned. It was no longer only Hudson seeking her, but each friend had joined in the search. It might be time to call in extra help, Willow sighed. Where could she be? Jenny cried. Dylan smiled to his friends. Don't be afraid. We'll find her. She must have found an amazing hiding spot and hasn't realized how much time has passed. He tried to assure them, and himself. I'm with Willow, announced Louie. We need to get help. The friends rushed to Grandpa Buzz and Grandma Honey's house. They explained to their sweet elders what was happening. The meadow was abuzz as swarms of neighbors and friends began to gather and search for their friend. Do you think the search party will find Grace soon? We'll get back to the story in a minute. But before we do, let's take a moment to review today's verse. Our memory verse is Proverbs 22:11. One who loves a pure heart and who speaks with grace will have a king for a friend. Can you say the verse with me? Proverbs 22:11. One who loves a pure heart and who speaks with grace will have the king for a friend. As Dylan would say, busy, busy, buzz, buzz. You did great, and learning verses is fun. Grace looked through the glass into her captor's eyes. She and the other bees from her hive had seen this boy Tommy as he stomped through the meadow. While she was sure he was a friendly boy to the other children, she had seen Tommy catch more than one caterpillar and firefly. She trembled as she recalled him shaking the other insects in his jar and laughing. "Please be kind to me," she said to Tommy. He didn't seem to understand her. He moved the jar closer to his face and grinned at her. "You're pretty," he said to her. "I'm going to keep you forever and ever." He giggled as he gave the jar a rough shake. Grace's head bumped the lid, and she could feel a bump forming between her antennae. She looked around the jar, hoping to find a hole or a crack from which she could escape. The only thing she could see was a few small puncture holes in the lid that Tommy had poked so she could breathe. Grace lowered herself onto a blade of grass on the bottom of the jar and began to cry. How would she ever get out of this situation? Things aren't looking good for Grace. How do you think she will be set free? We'll get back to our story in a minute, but before we do, let's review our verse. Today, our memory verse is Proverbs 22:11. One who loves a pure heart and who speaks with grace will have the king for a friend. Can you kids say that with me? Proverbs 22:11. One who loves a pure heart and who speaks with grace will have the king for a friend. As Dylan would say, busy, busy, buzz, buzz. Who's learning the verse? You're the one. Days passed. The search party did not give up. But each day, Dylan, Louie, Jimmy, Hudson, Jenny, Peyton, and Willow became more concerned. Grace's friends were trying to eat breakfast, but none of them were doing more than nibbling. They had no appetite. Jimmy licked his apple slice and sighed. What if we don't find her? What if an octopus flew out of the ocean and landed in her hiding spot and she died? I don't want her to be dead, Hudson cried. Peyton hugged Hudson. We're all worried about her, she said softly. Don't give up hope. Grandpa Buzz suggested they pray for Grace, and they all agreed, so the group gathered together and began to pray for her. Grace felt weak. Tommy wasn't a kind captor. He liked to shake the jar, forcing her to bump against the edges. Just making sure you're still alive, he would say to her. After lunch, Tommy decided to take her outside, and he was skipping along the sidewalk. In a jar I've got a bee, and she belongs to me, he sang out, laughing. Grace held tightly as she could to the stem of a dandelion that Tommy had put in the jar, but it wasn't helping her hold steady at all. It was bouncing around as much as she was. Grace was trying to think of another plan to hold herself sturdy when she felt the jar flying towards the ground. She looked to see Tommy fall to the ground. The glass around her shattered, and she tumbled along the concrete next to Tommy. Grace took her chance and flew as fast as she could in the direction of her hive. But when she heard Tommy crying, she turned back to look at her captor. Tommy sat on the ground with blood on his knee. He screamed out, "Mommy!" He was really hurt. Grace carefully eased back towards the boy. Moved with compassion, she found a tissue that had flown from someone's picnic table. It was heavy, but Grace was able to drag it towards Tommy and lay it over his skinned knee. How do you think Tommy will react towards Grace? We'll find out in a minute, but before we do, let's review our verse. Our memory verse is Proverbs 22:11. One who loves a pure heart and who speaks with grace will have the king for a friend. Can you kids say that with me? Proverbs 22:11. One who loves a pure heart and who speaks with grace will have the king for a friend. As Dylan would say, busy, busy, buzz, buzz, we show grace to everyone. When Tommy felt the tissue on his knee, he moved his hands away from his tear-filled eyes. Mom, he asked. But then he saw Grace. You, he exclaimed. How can you be kind to me after I was so cruel to you? Grace smiled at the boy. I don't want to see you hurting. I see your mom is coming and she can help you more. Tommy half smiled. You're not going to sting me. I deserve to be stung. God shows us mercy and grace, and I'd like to do the same for you, Grace said. After you feel better, maybe you can visit me in the meadow." Tommy sniffled his nose. "I might like that, and I won't capture you either." Grace grinned to Tommy. "Your mom is here," she said, "and my friends are probably worried for me. I need to go tell them I'm okay." She flitted away, feeling happy she could show him Grace. Tommy called after her, "Thanks again." As she returned to the hive, Grace's friends and neighbors swarmed around her, hugging her and eager to hear where she had been. Her friends brought her in to sit and gave her food, water, and a blanket. "Bruh," Hudson said, "I thought you were going to die." Grace grinned. "I might have thought that a few times the past couple days too," she admitted. As Grace told everyone about the last couple of days, they listened, mouth agape, grateful she was home. When she told about how she helped Tommy, Grandpa Buzz beamed with pride. "That's our Gracie bee," he said. "Grace is always graciously gracious," he sang. Grace recovered under the loving care of her hive mates, and Tommy even came by to check on her. He apologized to the hive and promised if they ever needed anything, he would help them out. As the first snow blanketed the meadow and the bees settled in for winter, they each remembered the example of graciousness that Grace had demonstrated, and they all promised themselves to try and follow her example. That's the end of our story today. Join us next time as we hear how Hudson learned to be humble. Proverbs 22:11. One who loves a pure heart and who speaks with grace will have the king for a friend.